Hello fellow classmates, I am taking a taxation course this semester and I created this calculator to determine the deductible expenses on Schedule E for rental property. I am not a tax expert, I'm just a student, but I wanted to share this with you because I know that some of these calculations can be quite time consuming, especially if you have to do several of them. So I created this calculator which you could recreate, and I'll show you how it works. First of all the cells that are gray have formulas or have a number in there that does not get changed at any point. The only numbers in this calculator that change are the ones here that are not gray. So if we put a number in for the rental income, it'll change so that you can figure out both methods at the same time. Notice how this changed to $15,000. This is a formula pointing at this cell. If I change the number of rental days to 100, it changes here too. So you only have to enter it into the calculator once to get both calculations, IRS method or tax court method. These numbers here in column C, I'm only going to show you one of the calculators because the other one is basically just a duplicate of the first one. The only difference being on the second one is that this number here and this number here is not a formula. It's 365 and it's 365 and it just stays that way. Up here it's a formula. Here it's 365, and that's because the tax court method uses 365 days a year for the mortgage interest and the property taxes. Usually you'll get a greater deduction for the taxpayer if you use the tax court method. I don't know if we will with my hypothetical numbers here, but those two numbers don't change. Other than that, everything in this formula or in this calculator down here for the tax court method is the same as the IRS method. So I'll just go over it real quick and show you what the formulas are. All the formulas in column set in row 7 here, they're all the same all the way down. Again, with the exception when you copy it, you need to change these to 365. To make it so that you can drag this cell down easier, you could just point it at, you could just say equals B3. And the problem is when you do that, when you copy it into other cells, it wants to maintain the relationship. It's kind of like playing Battleship. When it moves down, you drag it down a few cells, this one starts pointing at B4. This one starts pointing at B5. This one's now pointing at B6. To get around that, you can either type in equals B3 seven times or 8 times, or you can just type in equals B3 and put a $sign in front of the B and in front of the 3. And then when you drag it down, it will continue to point at B3 in all cases. You actually don't need to put one in front of the B because we're not changing columns. You could get away with just the 3 because the row is what's changing. But if you were moving to left and right, you'd want to put the $sign in front of the B also, so that you can go both directions, up and down, left and right. Out of habit, I'm just using both. I put my formula there. So B3 over here, this one is the same thing. It's pointing at B5. It's the total number of days used, which is the reason for this column here, this row. This row is just totaling up the total number of days, the personal use and the rental use days is totaling up to 140. That way it can be used here. The rental ratio is simply C7 divided by D7, and that gets dragged down. So it's C8 divided by D8. The management and travel fees, I just put a 0 because there's not going to be any portion of that that's going to be allocated to personal use. So just put a 0 in those two columns. Over here, it's also a 0. Total number of days used. I could actually put the 0 here instead of there. The total number of days used. It's just going to be. It could just be 0 across the board for that matter, because it's not going to matter. The total, when you're talking about the management and the travel, there's no formula. It is this deductible on Schedule E is just equal to B9, and for the travel, if it's applicable and approved, is just equals to B10. All of the expense from these two cells go here, so there is no formula involved. Same thing here. This one should just equal, it's times 0. This one should just equal, let me change that, equals that, and this one should be equal to that. No formula involved. So if I type in $200 here, it's just going to put $200 there. If I type in $150 here, it's going to put $150 there, and you notice that it did the same thing down here as I entered it up here. All of that goes towards the deductible on Schedule E. None of it is a personal expense, because you wouldn't have a personal expense allocated for management fees on the personal side of the property, on your personal use. So that makes sense to me. So again, back up here, this is C7 divided by D7. All the cells below, all the rows below match. Then let's jump over to column G real quick. It's B7 times E7, which is the mortgage interest times the rental ratio, $2,500. And then F is just the difference between B7 and G7. So basically whatever wasn't allocated to Schedule E is going to be allocated to personal. Then I put a note in these two cells for mortgage interest and property taxes that those expenses can actually be deducted on Schedule A, your personal itemized deductions. But the rest of these expenses, just like any other personal home, these are not deductible expenses. Same thing down here. So this note right here, check rental type to see if losses are allowed. That's just a reminder for myself to check and see, is this a primary personal, a primarily rental, or a personal and rental? Because depending on the type of rental it is, you may or may not be able to deduct expenses. For example, if it's primarily personal, meaning you rented it for less than 15 days, you're not even going to need to use this calculator because you're not going to claim any income or expenses. Then again, if it's primarily rental, you might be able to deduct losses. But if it's personal and rental, your losses are only deductible up to the extent that there is rental income. So in this case, I have this set. There's $15,000 income. There's $11,635 in expenses, which is just the sum of all these. So sum of G7 through G14. So there is a net income of $3,364 showing here. But if my rental income was only $9,000 with the same expenses, now all of a sudden my income is only $9,000 and my expenses are $11,635. So depending on the type of rental you have, you cannot deduct more than $9,000 in expenses. So I have this set up to tell me what the excess is, which is, it's telling me the excess amount is, it's the greater, the max of either 0 or G15 minus B2. So G15 is $11,365.71 minus $9,000. That's more than 0. So the excess is, it's going to fill in that cell with that amount, because that's more than 0. If I had a negative number, then it would put in the 0, because the 0 is actually the larger number. So the excess is $2,635.71. Again, if I put this back over here at 15,000, now it's going to show 0, because 0 is greater, because it would be a negative number. If you took G15 minus B12, you're going to get a negative number, so I don't want a negative number. So it's set up to tell me the max of either 0 or G15 minus B2. And then the net income is simply the rental income minus the expenses. Now the net income, the allowed expense, the allowed deductions, like I said, can't exceed the amount of income. So what I've done here is, let's put this at $10,000. The excess is $1,635.71, and what I have up here is just to show me that the actual maximum amount of money I'm going to be allowed That's why I put allowed there with these two little V's. They're supposed to represent arrows to point at the cell below it. The maximum allowable deduction for depreciation is actually going to be $2,292, because if I was to add all of these cells right here up, that's $10,000. That is the amount of income. I can't deduct more than that. So when I'm doing my work in the class, I don't want to put in there that the deduction is going to be $3,928. The maximum amount that I can deduct is going to be $2,292.86. But it doesn't change the allocated to personal amount. So I have this set off, just kind of set off to the side. In most cases, it's not a factor, but you might get a trick question in there. So just be aware of that. That's why I put this note here. Expenses are limited to rental income. That's true if it's a personal / rental. Not necessarily true for a primary rental. So just be aware of that. That's just a note. As a reminder, check your book for the actual tax law, tax rules based on what is and what isn't deductible. My main purpose here was just to show you the calculator, which is easy to create, really. Once you create this first row, almost all of it just drags down. This is just a total of that. This is just the most complicated cell in the whole thing is this one, because you use the max. By the way, you can also say equals minimum if you wanted it to have the smaller number of the two. Not applicable in this case, but in case you didn't know, in this case the net income is actually a loss, $1635.71. Could put a little note there to say net income loss if I wanted to, just to further improve my calculator. And that's it. Hopefully this calculator will come in handy for you in your course. I know it helped out in my class already when I was under the time limit trying to figure out a bunch of questions that it would have required me to do a lot of calculations manually. So good luck in your course.